In this second video in this series, I want to focus on a particular facet of the context of John and his churches, but this is a facet that pervaded public life and public discourse. I'm speaking of the reality of Roman rule and the many ways in which Roman rule and the ideology of Roman rule intersected with the lives and consciousness of the Christians in Asia Minor. The members of the churches John addresses were exposed daily to a well-defined story about the way things are, the way the world works, and therefore the way to get along to their advantage. Inscriptions throughout the city, the coins with which all business was transacted, statues, temples, civic processions, public announcements, all the available media of the first century, tells parts of this story and keep its picture of the way things are visible. John will tell a very different story, drawing a very different picture, the view from the throne of God and the Lamb, in order to motivate members of these 7 congregations to resolve the challenges facing them in the way that nurtures a clear, uncompromising witness to that God and his anointed. Here we will first explore the public story in depth, for it is the story foundational to the society and structures in which the members of the 7 churches live, and the story that John most directly challenges in his revelation of the way things really are in the sight of the one God. The public story of Rome begins with the fall of Troy, from whose ashes emerges a hero, Aeneas, who would plant the seeds of a world empire. His story is told by Virgil, a poet in Augustus's court and author of the Aeneid, the court epic of the Augustan age. Virgil celebrates the promise of Zeus, the king of the gods, that the Romans would rule the sea and all the lands about it. The poet here refers to the orbis terrarum, the circle of the lands about the Mediterranean that was considered the civilized world. The map, developed under the direction of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man during his war against Antony and his consolidation of power, illustrates this concept. The Mediterranean Sea stands at the center of the map, with all the known territories of Europe, Africa, and Asia, as far as India and even Sri Lanka, arranged around the Mediterranean in a great circle, with a small opening between Spain and North Africa. This was the world that counted. Zeus asserts that the destiny of Rome will be to bring the whole world under law's dominion. The gifts and graces of Rome were, according to Virgil, to pacify, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered, and battle down the proud. To pacify here has the sense of to impose peace, normally by military means. Indeed, as the wings of the Roman eagle overshadowed more and more of the Mediterranean basin, it exercised authority over every tribe and people and language and nation. Minucius Felix, a 2nd century Christian, would write of the Romans that their power and authority has occupied the circuit of the whole world, referring once again to the concept of the orbis terrarum. Thus it has propagated its empire beyond the paths of the sun and the bounds of the ocean itself. Plutarch, a near contemporary of John, celebrated the rise of Rome uniting the Mediterranean region. Rome developed and grew strong, and attached to herself not only nations and peoples, but foreign kingdoms beyond the sea. And then at last the world found stability and security when the controlling power entered into a single, unwavering cycle and world order of peace. Rome was thus indeed seen as the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. These writers were aware that other nations existed that were not under Roman dominion, at least not yet, and that indeed often posed a threat to Rome's dominion in some areas and to Rome's borders. Nevertheless, authority over the kings of the earth and over the whole world was regularly attributed to Rome during this period. The power of Rome was visually portrayed in the image of the goddess Roma, the visible representation of the order, the rule of law, the peace and stability that Rome's imperial rule brought. She was often featured on the reverse of coins. She is more prominently visible in the cult statues throughout the Mediterranean. Roma was given the epithet Aeterna, an epithet that persists to this day when we hear Rome called the Eternal City, often by tourist bureaus. Thus, Rome's supporters and propagandists advanced the bold claim that Rome's destiny was unchanging and everlasting. Plutarch reflects this when he affirms that Rome provided a, quote, secure mooring cable, end quote, for the world, and used adjectives such as unwavering to describe her rule, forgetting all the lessons of world history. The prophecy expert that insists on looking to the future for a beast and his one-world empire needs to look more closely at the images projected of Rome in the first century and the perception of the Roman Empire held by most of its inhabitants, including John and his audience, and purposefully promoted by imperial propaganda. Rome was also celebrated as the source of prosperity for the whole world. The luxury of Rome was taken as a sign that a golden age of prosperity had returned to the entire Mediterranean world. In a speech praising Rome, Aelius Aristides, another near contemporary of John, describes the scene in Rome thus: "Around lie the continents far and wide, pouring an endless flow of goods to Rome. There is brought from every land and sea whatever is brought forth by the seasons, and is produced by all countries, rivers, lakes, and the skills of Greeks and foreigners. Anyone who wants to behold all these products must either journey through the whole world to see them, or else come to this city. One can see so many cargoes from India, or if you wish, from Arabia, that one may surmise that the trees there have been left permanently bare, and that those people must come here whenever they need anything." Aristides is oblivious to the downside of the Roman economy, but he is a member of the elite and hence a voice for the public official story of Rome. Such elite sources paint a picture of a world power that brought tremendous benefits to humankind, an end to civil strife, protection from invasion, improvement of means of travel by land through expert road construction, and by sea through expansion of ports and harbors, as well as the dramatic reduction of brigandage and piracy. Trade is facilitated, steady distribution of grain and relief in times of shortfall improved, and the rule of law maintained. Much of this is true. Moreover, individual emperors give significant benefits to cities in Asia Minor, reinforcing the public discourse with tangible demonstrations of its truth. Tiberius provided financial assistance to rebuild several cities in Asia Minor after an earthquake in 17 CE. Nero dredged and restored the harbor of Ephesus, restoring the city's most important economic asset. Domitian provided Laodicea with a stadium and Smyrna with an aqueduct. Rome could be a great safety net and a source of significant blessings. According to this public story, divine providence was at work in the rise and reign of Rome, and it was at work particularly in the rise and reign of Augustus and his successors. In this denarius from the reign of the Emperor Trajan, whose face and titles are featured on the front of the coin, we see on the back the image of Providence, personified as a stately goddess. The lettering around her reads Pro Aug, which is short for Providentia Augusti, the providence of Augustus, in effect meaning the working of divine providence through Augustus, and thereafter everyone who bears the name Augustus, every single emperor, takes that title for himself. This lady rests her shoulder upon a pillar, which is, of course, iconographic for stability. And at her feet is a ball, which represents the world, the globe, on which one can see two lines drawn representing the temperate zone in which civilization can flourish, another representation of the circle of the lands, as it were. This coin expresses visibly the conviction that the gods were indeed providing stability for the entire globe through the emperor, through the Augusti, the Augustuses. Now, Rome was an empire already long before Augustus, in the sense that the Roman Republic already controlled most of the lands around the Mediterranean. But the Republic offered power-hungry senators, like Marcus Licinius Crassus, Sextus Pompeius, and Julius Caesar, the first triumvirate, too much opportunity for factionalism and ultimately civil war. The Mediterranean was twice subjected to all the horrors of civil war between about 48 BC and 31 BC, when Octavian, who would soon be given the name Augustus, the title Augustus, finally emerged from the strife victorious. He quickly forgave the armies of his rival, Mark Antony, uniting their power to his own. By universal consent, a phrase that is very important in this era, Augustus accepted perpetual powers in the Republic. Thus, government became stable, and the provinces flourished again. All this happening by universal consent meant that the rule of Augustus, the consolidation of republican offices under Augustus, was legitimate as far as the people under him were concerned. He did not impose totalitarian rule. He was given by universal public acclaim the position that he enjoyed. Toward the end of his life, Augustus drew up a list of his political and military actions and achievements on behalf of the Roman order, the Res Gestae Augusti. After his death, the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the things accomplished by the deified Augustus. After his death, this list was inscribed in public spaces across the empire, reminding people everywhere of the legitimacy of the new order ushered in by Augustus and continued then by his successor, Tiberius. In this list, he speaks of having obtained all things by universal consent and of being given the title Augustus by universal decree. Far from being a tyrant, this inscription claims, Augustus had greatness thrust upon him by universal acclaim, and appropriately so, given all that he had done on behalf of the world. This modern replica of the full inscription of the Res Gestae, appropriately featured on the side of the museum that now houses the altar of the Augustan peace, gives a sense of just how much Augustus was able to cram into that list of things done on behalf of Rome and the Roman order, and thus the propriety of his having been acclaimed the first among peers, the princeps, over that entire order. A particularly important expression for summing up Augustus's gifts was Pax Augusti, the Augustan peace, or peace of Augustus. This was the beginning of the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, to which reference would be made throughout the Principate. It celebrated the end of the series of civil wars, as well as the new ordering of the government throughout the provinces of the empire. The Senate commemorated this peace in an extraordinary way. As Augustus relates in his own words, "On my return from Spain and Gaul, that is, about 13 BC, after successfully arranging affairs in those provinces, the Senate resolved that an altar of the Augustan peace should be consecrated next to the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, in honor of my return, and ordered that the magistrates and priests and Vestal virgins should perform an annual sacrifice there. This altar, which has been uncovered and fully restored, is housed within a marble monument about 40 feet square, into which is built a staircase leading up to the altar proper. It sat in a prominent central location in Rome, and it was given empire-wide notice through display on the reverse of several coin mintings, such as on the back of this bronze coin minted under the Emperor Nero. This was just one manifestation of an empire's acclamation of Augustus as the bringer of peace and the promise of a new era. An inscription at Priene, another city in Asia Minor, located between Ephesus and Miletus to the south, captures the spirit of this new age. The provincial council of Asia, of the Roman province of Asia, which was the regional body responsible for, among other things, the promotion of imperial cult, issued a decree that the birthday of Augustus would become the official New Year's Day of the calendar year. Because Providence has set all things in most perfect order by giving us Augustus, whom she filled with virtue that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a savior, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things well, and because he, Caesar, by his appearing, surpassed all previous benefactors and leaves posterity no hope of another surpassing what he has done, and because the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good news for the world that came by reason for him, and the decree goes on to state, because of all this, it seems fitting to make his birthday, September 23rd, the new New Year's Day in the province, because it is the beginning, in effect, of this new era. Speaking of a Savior's birth as the beginning of the good news for the world, the Evangelion, should cause readers of the New Testament to take notice. The word from the inscription, translated as good tidings or good news, here is a form of Evangelion, the same Greek word that is so prominent in the New Testament, whether translated as good news or gospel. This inscription hailed Augustus as Savior, Soter, one whose gifts to humankind no one would ever surpass in the future. The text of this resolution was inscribed in temples to Augustus across the province of Asia, making its language available to the citizens of the 7 cities addressed by Revelation, by the standards of Christian language, which promoted its own Savior. Acclamations of the emperor were nothing less than messianic. Temples were erected to Augustus across the eastern Mediterranean, where people were accustomed to treating their rulers and exceptional benefactors as gods. Nicholas of Damascus, a friend of Herod the Great, explained the phenomenon in the opening paragraph of his Life of Augustus in this way. All people address him as Augustus in accordance with their estimation of his honor, revering him with temples and sacrifices across islands and continents, organized in cities and provinces, matching the greatness of his virtue and repaying his benefactions toward them. Since the emperor's gifts matched those of the deities, it was deemed only fitting that the expressions of the gratitude and loyalty of his subjects should take on the forms used to communicate with the gods themselves, that is, the form of worship. Roman power was represented in the 7 cities named by John in many ways, but perhaps the most prominent and enduring was the imperial cult. All 7 cities addressed by John had cultic sites. 6, all but Thyatira, had imperial temples. 5, all but Philadelphia and Laodicea, had imperial altars and subsidized priesthoods. Many of the cities thus had multiple cult sites of the emperors. Pergamum was a center for imperial cult in the province, the first in the province to honor Augustus with a temple built to him and to Roma, authorized in 29 BC, for which it won the honorific title Neokoros from the emperor. The Greek word Neokoros in effect means temple keeper or temple warden. It signaled that Pergamum was in effect the chief custodian of the worship of Augustus in the province of Asia Minor. This coin, minted during the reign of Claudius, shows a representation of this temple erected in Pergamum to Rome and Augustus. It shows two cult statues within the temple, the one on the left being the statue of Augustus, dressed in military attire and holding a spear, and the one on the right, that of the goddess Roma, extending a wreath of victory over the head of Augustus. This temple, this representation of the temple was a common one throughout the first century. Here it appears again in slightly less artistic form on the back of a denarius minted under Domitian, who reigned toward the end of the first century, about 81 to 96 AD. In the same year that Pergamum erected and actually officially consecrated this temple to Roma and Augustus, Ephesus rededicated part of its temple of Artemis, not the great Artemisian that was one of the wonders of the world, but the smaller temple of Artemis right in the heart of the political center of the city, to the deified Julius Caesar and to the goddess Roma. The connection between imperial cult and civic pride shows up toward the end of the first century AD and the beginning of the second, as we find these two cities, Ephesus and Pergamum, competing with one another over the title of Neokoros of an imperial temple. After Pergamum had held this distinction for over a century, Ephesus undertook a new initiative, building a temple to the Flavian dynasty in the heart of its civic downtown. The main object of this cult was the living member of the Flavian dynasty, the Emperor Domitian, again about 81 to 96 AD. The temple was erected on this very prominent plateau that stands over, in effect, the civic marketplace and some of the main civic buildings, like this columned portico where a lot of business was transacted, and the city hall and the meeting place of the city council, which stood behind that portico. Originally on this site, a huge temple surrounded by courtyards and walls, a plateau that is artificially extended by means of these arches, just to make the area large enough to accommodate Ephesus's grand plans for this temple. This temple originally housed a 24 or so foot tall cult statue of the Emperor Domitian. Although this might have actually been the Emperor Titus, scholars are somewhat conflicted over exactly which member of the Flavian family they found up in that cult site. The city of Ephesus kept an active cult going on this site to honor Domitian. For this amazing display of loyalty, of gratitude, of dedication to the emperor, Ephesus was finally awarded the title Neokoros as well, which it proudly displayed in inscription after inscription after inscription. The visitor to the city of Ephesus can find many public inscriptions with the word neokoros in it, and especially in the formula the council and the people of the temple-keeping city of the Ephesians. So the way Ephesus talked about itself from this point on changed to highlight the civic honor that it had coveted and finally gained, a civic honor inseparably entwined with the worship of the emperor. Now, Pergamum was not to be outdone. Immediately they began claiming prominence again by virtue of having been the first to be named Neokoros, and thus they began to talk about themselves not simply as Hebule kai ha demos, the city council and the people of the temple warden Pergamines, of the temple-keeping Pergamines, but they now talked about themselves as the first to be awarded the Neokoros, city of the Pergamines. And this became their new claim to fame and way of identifying themselves. 15 years later, however, they would win the honor of building the massive temple to Trajan, emperor from 98 to 117 AD, for which they were awarded the title Neokoros a second time. The scale of this temple is astounding, by the way. Here you could get a sense of it by the size of these passers-by. The temple towers over those who come to this place to worship the emperor Trajan from afar. And like the temple to Domitian, to the Flavian household in Ephesus, this temple was built upon a platform that had to be artificially extended just to be large enough to accommodate the scope of what the city wanted to do for its emperor. Here is an artist's reconstruction of the temple itself in the center, surrounded by a large courtyard, itself then surrounded also by columned porticos, and you can see the slope of the hill here. This was built on the very brow of the Acropolis in Pergamum, and the platform had to be artificially extended by means of a series of ramps holding up then the platform, which can still be seen today. Now, for its pains, it was awarded the title Neokoros a second time, and they therefore began to celebrate their civic identity as the twice awarded the Neokoros, council and people of the city of Pergamum, dis Neokoros. Ephesus would stay in the running, however. They would win the honor of building a temple to Trajan's successor, the Emperor Hadrian, who reigned from 117 to 138, thus becoming themselves twice to be awarded the Neokorate, the distinction of being Neokoros. Pergamum's response to this? They began to refer to themselves as the first to be twice awarded the title of Neokoros, council and city of the council and people of the city of the Pergamines. So throughout this period, one finds civic pride, civic rivalry, civic identity in the descriptions of these cities of themselves in all of these inscriptions, and dozens more that are visible on these locations, to be bound to the imperial cult and the city's dedication to the cult of the emperors. The cities of Asia Minor were as enthusiastic and invested in hosting the imperial cult, as modern cities are about convincing a major football team to relocate or winning the bid to host the Olympics. This tells us something else about the cult of the emperors. The cult was not imposed on the provinces by the emperors. It was locally motivated, the response of provincial populations to the tremendous power of the emperor, which was perceived as truly godlike, and a response to the benefits that the rule of the emperor brought to the provinces. Such displays of loyalty and gratitude ensured both that the empire would remain strong, hence averting the disasters of civil war and foreign invasion and ensuring continued peace and prosperity, and that the emperor would remain well disposed toward the province when it was in need of imperial aid. It was also a most politic decision that the province's ambassadors to the emperor should also be those elites who held priesthoods in the imperial cult. The beneficent god in the temple was the face of the emperor that Rome wanted the provinces to see. The devoted and grateful functionaries presiding in those temples was the face of the province that Asia Minor wanted Rome to see. The imperial cult was embedded in the cults of the traditional Greco-Roman gods. Frequently, the statues of the emperor and the Olympian gods shared the same sacred space, emphasizing their connectedness. In Ephesus, for example, we find Julius Caesar and Artemis worshipped in the same temple, with a portion of this older temple to Artemis dedicated to the imperial cult. In Pergamum, the temple to Trajan sits in very close proximity. The Temple of Trajan ruins are here. It sits in very close proximity to the Temple of Athena, which once stood over the theater, and the great altar of Zeus, also overlooking the temple of Dionysus. The emperor was not simply a god, but he was the vessel through which the gods were believed to be establishing order and showering their gifts and favor upon humanity. One of the titles of the emperors was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest or high priest of the Roman world, who mediated divine favor, the favor of the traditional Greco-Roman gods, for the entire population of the Mediterranean world. In these two ways, the rule of the emperor was grounded in the rule of the gods themselves, first by virtue of the worship of the emperor being incorporated into the worship of the traditional gods, and in the presentation of emperor after emperor, beginning with Julius Caesar, as in effect the chief mediator between gods and humankind. The emperor was most often worshipped in conjunction with the goddess Roma, or Roma Aeterna, the personified and deified representation of Rome. The worship of Roma as a goddess was the ultimate legitimation of Roman power and the means by which it operated. The city of Smyrna had established a temple to Rome as early as 195 BC. Augustus himself refused to allow any temple to be consecrated to himself unless it were also consecrated to Roma. The imperial cult thus also reinforced the belief that Rome was chosen by the gods to rule the world, to subdue the nations, and to lead them into a golden age of lasting peace and well-being united under her banner. Participation in the cults of the emperor and Roma demonstrated, in the eyes of the local citizens and elites, appropriate gratitude toward the emperor and the Roman order for maintaining the peaceful conditions that facilitated stability, even prosperity. It evidenced that piety and sense of duty that assured one's neighbors of one's commitment to do one's part to support that order on which the well-being of the local community depended. By promoting withdrawal and distance from the cult, Christians fell under their neighbors' suspicion. Christian communities could look like pockets of dissent and potentially sedition, at the very least, like unreliable members of the community. One more history lesson is necessary to finish setting the stage. The line of succession founded by Augustus remained fairly strong for a century, from 31 BC with Augustus's own consolidation of power through 68 AD. But it came to a crashing end when Nero committed suicide in that last year without leaving a viable heir. The empire reverted once more to chaos in the midst of civil war. 68 to 69 AD is remembered as the year of the four emperors, each of the first three contenders enjoying their overlapping reigns for just a few months each. The armies of the various contenders swept across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Egypt, wreaking havoc wherever they met in battle, but also wherever they passed through, conscripting supplies and requisitioning whatever they needed. This was also the period in which Judea and Jerusalem had been under siege with the suppression of the first Jewish revolt against Rome. When the fourth contender, Flavius Vespasianus, emerged as the last man standing at the end of this year, everyone was prepared to embrace him along with his two sons as the ruler of the world. The mortal wound that had threatened to dissolve the empire had found healing at last. Rome was able to stand upright once more. The cities of Asia Minor had displayed uncommon enthusiasm for the cult of the emperors since Augustus, but this enthusiasm was dramatically renewed with the coming of the Flavian dynasty. The dedication of the new temple to Domitian in Ephesus in about 90 AD bears witness to such local fervor. But the imperial cult, we must always remember, was not merely a matter of stone temples, lifeless statues, and voiceless inscriptions passively waiting to be noticed. Priests and celebrants regularly brought these sites and their ideology to life, following a calendar of imperial celebrations, including the monthly commemoration of the reigning emperor's birthday. Leonard Thompson, a contemporary Revelation scholar, describes the scenes thus. Imperial temples and sanctuaries were wreathed with flowers. Animals were sacrificed at various altars throughout the main locations of the city, for example, the council house, temples of other deities, theaters, the main squares, stadiums, and gymnasiums. These political, religious, and public buildings were linked together by processions of dignitaries, garlanded animals being led to slaughter, and bearers of icons and symbols of the emperor. As the procession passed by, householders would sacrifice on small altars outside their homes. The whole city thus had opportunity to join in the celebration. The air would be filled with the sound of hymns chanted to the emperor and to the gods on behalf of the emperor, as by a community choir formed in Pergamum, specifically to sing hymns to Augustus as to a god in the imperial temple. Scenes of worship centered upon the image of the emperor were both elaborate and commonplace in the experience of John and his audience throughout these 7 cities. Every glimpse of such an edifice or image, every civic festival celebrating the birthday of an emperor or a member of his household, every time a person stopped to count his change, these experiences all extended invitations to the residents of these cities to remember at least some part of this official story about Roman rule. The gods in their generosity gave us Rome and her emperors to provide the gifts of stability, prosperity, safety from harm, relief in need. Thanks be to the gods. When John speaks, then, of a great city, sitting upon 7 hills and having authority over the kings of the earth, he speaks of a reality that resonates immediately with the hearer's experience. The 7 hills of Rome were, of course, celebrated in literature and in coinage, as on the back of this sesterce minted again during the reign of Vespasian. A yearly festival in the capital in Rome commemorated Rome's expansion to enclose the 7th hill within the city limits. On this basis, both Christian hearers and outsiders would immediately connect John's Babylon with Rome. When John speaks of a city into which the wealth of the world flowed, one would not have to be a Christian to make the obvious connection. And what an extreme makeover Roma Aeterna receives at John's hands. Similarly, when John uses images from Daniel representing world empires to speak of a beast, fatally wounded but healed, worshipped by the inhabitants of the earth in a manner involving a cult image, exercising authority over a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multinational empire, the Roman emperors were immediately available to John's hearers as plausible reference, whose cult was practiced in each and every one of their cities, whose rule and divinity were everywhere proclaimed.